All right, well, we're going to continue our series in the book of Revelation. If you'd like to turn with me, we're going to be in Revelation chapter 17 this evening. And as we've been looking at this book, we know that the author is the Apostle John, who received this revelation of Jesus Christ while he was on the island of Patmos. And he writes this book, or this epistle or letter, and this is addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor who were present in this time. And as he addresses these different churches, he starts to explain some of these different sets of 7 throughout the book. And the first 7 we see is 7 seals, which are being undone by the Lamb in the heavenly throne room of this scroll that was in the right hand of God. And the Lamb, who is Jesus Christ, he takes the scroll and he starts to undo these different seals. And as we worked last week, I had some of this filled out for us. But basically, if you feel like you want to, you're welcome to take a picture of this. But this basically has every single thing that basically is being done, and it has the biblical text verses next to it. But basically, we see these different events that are unfolding throughout time that are impacting the world. And at the 6th, we see that there is this interlude. There's a pause where it gives some type of imagery of some symbols, and then it goes to then the final seal. And then from there, it goes into these 7 trumpets, which likewise start to impact the world, and they're known as these 7 trumpet judgments of God's wrath. And we start to see different things like the land, agriculture being impacted. We see mountains of fire hitting the sea, affecting the waters. We see the heavenly bodies of light being affected. Multiple different things, and there are different views on interpreting this, on whether or not this is meant to be literal, whether this is symbolic, whether this is past, present, or future. A lot of fun ways of trying to discern the text and interpret what's going on here. And then lastly, we see these 7 bowls, which then are seeming to be these most severe judgments of God's wrath that are impacting the world, or those who are worshiping the beast and those who are rejecting Christ as the Lord and the Savior. And we talked a little bit about the relationship between the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. And there's basically 2 views out there. There's the view of recapitulation, which simply means it's a recap. And so what they would say is that all 3 sets of 7 here are just recapping basically the same event. So they're just describing the same story just a little bit differently. So you'll see some similarities, but you'll also see some differences. Or the other view is chronological progression, which that simply just means that we're moving forward in time. So as we move forward to this point, we get to the 7th seal here, and when we unlock this 7th seal, that is what unlocks the 7 trumpets. And then when we get to the 7th trumpet, that unlocks the 7 bowls. And so whenever we get to this final point here, we are actually at the end of history. We are at the point where Christ returns. So there are some different ways to understand that, and if you've been with us as we've been working through the study, you'll see that we've basically hit all of these different things, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. And now, as we find ourselves in chapter 17, you'll find that we're finally outside of these different groups of 7. So we're not in the 7 churches, we're not in the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, or the 7 bowls, and we're going to be looking instead tonight at 2 different characters of Revelation chapter 17. We're going to see the scarlet woman and the scarlet beast. And if you do remember at the end of chapter 16, where we see the 7th bowl, right? It describes the earth utterly being shaken, right? We see all of these different things, this earthquake happening, and it describes in verse 19, it says, "The great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." So what we're seeing in the very last bowl judgment, so the last set of all 7s, right? The 7th bowl, we see that God is pronouncing judgment on the great city of Babylon. And so what we're going to be looking at now in chapter 17, chapter 18, and chapter 19 of the book of Revelation is going to zero in on that final bowl. So that seventh bowl judgment that we see here in chapter 16, verses 17 to 21, that's what it's zeroing in on. We're going to look at the judgment of Babylon and how Christ and his kingdom come and conquer it and then make all things new. So that's what we're going to be seeing in the next few chapters, how God is going to judge Babylon and bring his kingdom to the earth. So with that being said, we're going to look at this chapter now of 17, if you haven't already turned there with us. And if you look at the chapter, just at a quick glance, you'll see that it's kind of broken into two sections. You have verses 1 to 6, which is going to describe the scarlet woman and the scarlet beast. And then in verses 7 to 18, you're going to see that it gives the meaning, or it actually gives us kind of an interpretation, which is good, right? Because when we look at the book of Revelation, there's a lot that doesn't give us an interpretation. And even with the interpretation, as we'll see tonight, it's still not fully that easy to understand. So we're going to be looking at both. So we're going to take the first half of 1 to 6. I'll read that for us, and then we'll unpack that a little bit, and then we'll move to the second section. And then after that, I'll share with you the 3 different interpretations for the whole chapter. Okay? So verses 1 to 6 says this. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her head a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement." So we see then in verses 1 to 6, we are introduced to this scarlet woman and the scarlet beast. And in verses 1 to 2, it actually lets us know that John is getting this vision, or he's seeing this because one of the angels who have had one of the bowls, so potentially maybe even the final bowl angel, maybe is showing this, telescoped or zooming in view, right, on what's going on here in this bowl judgment. And so this angel shows John the judgment that is to come for this great harlot. And it describes then that there's this woman who is dressed in scarlet, and she's at first mentioned as being someone who is sitting on the many waters. And then it goes from there to say that she is then sitting upon a scarlet beast. And that scarlet beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. So what I'll do first is just, when we look at the scarlet beast, you'll already probably notice a lot of similarities to what we've already been introduced to in Revelation chapter 13. Because if you remember the beast from the sea, he was the beast that comes from the abyss, right? That was summoned by Satan, or the red dragon. And that beast had 7 heads and 10 horns. And when you look at majority of the interpreters, almost all of them universally recognize the scarlet beast of chapter 17 as the same beast in Revelation 13. So, some unique things, obviously, is that we're going to talk about is we see that he has 7 heads and 10 horns, which is exactly how it was described in chapter 13. However, it does mention now that the beast is scarlet, which we didn't see in the past. How the beast is being called red. Likewise, this woman is going to be adorned or covered in purple and red. And I think it's interesting that the dragon, who is Satan, is also red. So we see this pattern, this symbolic reference, I think, to the fact that these individuals are covered in blood. I think that's what this is to point to. How Satan and his minions, those who worship and follow the dragon, they will be covered in the same blood because they are all a part of this same war. They're all, their purpose is to destroy and to kill. And so we see this connection that they're all red individuals, the scarlet woman, the scarlet beast, and the red dragon. But when we look at the woman specifically, it gives some other characteristics. It says in verse 4 that she's adorned with some gold and precious stones and pearls. So we see these precious stones that are described. And I think what this is alluding to is that this woman is someone who appears to be wealthy or well off or rich to the world's eyes, right? It looks very attractive or alluring. It's tempting to you. So you see this woman and at first glance seems to be, maybe seductive in some sense. But then it goes on and says, and she's holding something, which is a golden cup, and it's full of the abominations, it says. So she has a golden cup, and it says it's full of the abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. So what we see, though at first glance maybe she seems to be appealing, we see that actually she's very deadly, just like the beast and just like the dragon. And then it goes on in verse 5, and it says, and this woman has on her forehead a saying or a name that is written. So we have a name on the forehead. And this is something, if we've noticed, this has been a repeated thing as well in the text of Revelation, is we see that the saints, right, those who were sealed by God, they have the name of God on their forehead. We know that the beast worshipers, those who reject Christ and accept this leader or this individual, they take his mark, the mark of the beast, and they say that 666 is on their head or on their hand. And now we're seeing that there's this woman who has a name written on her head. So we see this continuing to go out as a pattern throughout the text. And what's interesting, as it describes this woman as a harlot, something that was common in the Roman culture actually is if a woman would wear a headband if she was a prostitute, and it would have the name of her owner on it. And so when we're looking at this woman, it seems as if she kind of is showing who she represents or who is owning her. And it describes in the text, and it says, and there's a couple ways that your translation could say it. It could either say, this is the name which is a mystery, and then it says Babylon the Great, or it could say that the name written is mystery, Babylon the Great. But anyway, we see there's something to do with a mystery of this woman who has Babylon the Great, which is a city that many of us have probably heard of in the text of Scripture before. And then it says, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So we see that this name of this woman is associated clearly with Babylon, right? And we've already seen a couple times before we were even truly introduced to Babylon that this is a city that is fallen, that God is judging, right? So it's been talked about even before we even knew anything about her. But it says now that this is the woman of Babylon, the city that we've been introduced to. And it's interesting, in Babylonian language, the word Babylon actually means gateway to God. But if anyone knows the story of the Tower of Babel, we see that in that region, right, we have this tower, right? The group of individuals, they move to this region. They say, we're going to build a tower, and they're going to say, we're going to go up to heaven. Basically, they're trying to have a cosmic rebellion against God. They're trying to say, we're going to heaven. We're going to be made great. We're going to have basically honor and glory and worship. They're trying to steal and rob God of his glory. And what happens then is God judges, right, the people of this area, and that we know that obviously he destroys the tower, and he basically confuses all the language. And so now that phrase Babel, right, where we see Babylon, it actually now has the connotation with confusion. So now if you think of it, we have Babylon, which initially had this meaning of gateway to God or entrance to God, and now we see confusion in the mix. So it seems as if when we are thinking about Babylon, and we see it throughout the Bible, how there's this corrupt version of God. We see paganism, we see idol worship, we see all of these different things, all these distortions, and how the name of Babylon has to do with mixing and confusing people about who God truly is. And so it's interesting that this woman then has this name, and then it also says that she is the mother of harlots and abominations. So not only is she a city that is corrupt and causes confusion and alters the way we understand God, but then it also says, and she also has children. She's a mother who has harlots and abominations that are born out of her. So if you remember the contrast, now we had the woman who was having the baby of the man-child, right, which was Jesus, who came and then ascended. We had this woman who was running from the dragon, who seemed to be pure and good, right, beautiful like the sun and the moon. Well, now we have this individual who is basically the exact opposite, right, who has the cup of abominations, who is having harlots and abomination as children. All of these different things are going on within this woman. And I think this is somewhat similar to Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 7, where it discusses Babylon. And it says, Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand that made all the earth drunk. The nations drank her wine, therefore the nations are deranged. So I think what this is referring to is how Babylon, as a city or a civilization, it corrupts the world. It corrupts other people groups, other nations. And so this individual, this woman, whoever she is or whatever she truly represents, is like Babylon of old in the Old Testament, how it corrupted the cultures and societies. Likewise, this woman is doing the same thing. She's starting to corrupt different people groups, and she's starting to promote and create these harlots and these abominations. And then finally in verse 6, we see that it says, and this woman, she is drunk on the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. So we see once again how just in Jeremiah 51, as well as this text of Revelation 17, we see this golden cup of drinking and of wrath and being drunkenness, which I think leads to corruption and confusion. We see then this woman, she is basically being intoxicated by the blood of the saints. So once again, we see the blood, we see the redness of this woman. And so what this means then is that this woman, who is known as Babylon the Great, she is someone who is either directly or indirectly responsible for the killing of the saints. So we know that as we've been looking through this book, there's tons of persecution for the church or for the saints. There's tons of persecution for those who are trusting in Jesus, right? Who are overcoming the beast by the word of their testimony and by the blood of the Lamb. So we see that many different groups of people who worship Christ are being killed by this woman and or also the beast. And she basically is intoxicated by it. She loves the fact that the church or that the saints are being persecuted, that they are being killed. So this is something that she enjoys. So we see clear wickedness, we see clear evil in these individuals. So we kind of at least pictured a little bit of who they are. Let's go to the verses of 7 to 18 now, and this will be the meaning or the interpretation that the angel gives, because John basically, he sees this, right? He first hears that it's going to be the judgment of Babylon, which sounds good, right? Like, let's judge Babylon, that's bad, like we don't like Babylon. And then all of a sudden he goes and he sees, as he's in the wilderness, he sees there's this powerful woman who doesn't seem to be being judged or killed or anything, and he's frightened because she's basically has all the blood of the saints. So she's basically been successful for at least some period of time. So he's seeing this, and it says he's marveling or he's shocked. He can't believe it. And so then now we're going to see how the angel responds, because John is shocked by what he's seeing. But the angel said to me, "Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. All right, so we see now this angel is giving a description that might be helpful to some, might be more confusing to others as we're looking at this text, right? But one thing that I think that before we go into too much detail is, as we're looking at the scarlet woman and we see the scarlet beast, is there seems to be a very close connection between these two individuals. They have some similarities with scarlet. They both have similarities to some type of abominations where they both hate the Lord. They're both persecuting and warring against the saints. We see that the woman is riding on the beast, so there's clearly some way that they work together, but they are different. They're not identical. So as we start to look at some of these interpretations, you'll notice how close some of these are, and you might be like, well, that sounds like they're saying they're the same thing. So as we look to this, just to remember, there's some similarities. They're closely knit, but they're not identical in what they represent. So we look then, and before we go to the woman, the angel actually addresses the description of the beast first. And once again, this is the beast of Revelation 13. So if you need to, later as we close tonight, if you want to look back over that and see what they said about Revelation 13 and see how it connects to here. But we see that this beast in verse 8 is described as the beast that was and is not and yet is. And you'll see that there's a lot of language that's very similar to that, which makes this really, really hard. And I was getting a headache studying this, trying to figure out the different ways people are trying to explain what is going on here. But what it seems as it describes this beast is that the beast has some type of past existence. It has some type of not yet existence. And it also has some type of future manifestation or future consummation. So as we look to the 7 heads and the 10 horns, I think that'll help us a little bit, because it's not as we think. Remember, this is symbolic, right? So we're not literally thinking of a physical beast that's running around the streets and he exists right now, but he doesn't exist. Rather, there's more to it, right? We're looking at this symbolically. So when we look at the 7 heads, right, so it has 7 heads and 10 horns, this is going to help us kind of unlock what's going on with this beast. In verses 9 to 11, it lets us know that the 7 heads here are 7 mountains and 7 kings. I'll put that on the board for us. The 7 heads So that represents 7 mountains and 7 kings. So when we are thinking about this, we're thinking, okay, so what would the representation of 7 mountains, like would that be some type of geography? Is this a location that's letting us know about where this beast may rule or what this beast represents? And then also there are 7 kings, right? So who are these rulers or these this power grouping? Who do these represent? But it lets us at least know that that is what the 7 heads are meant. So when we're thinking about how the beast might be in the past, present, and future, we got to think about it being 7 kings and 7 mountains exist, right? So there might be a time frame of these different kings, right? So that might help you a little bit as we start to unfold. Then we look at the verse 12. It says, and the 10 horns are 10 kings who will reign with the beast. So we saw there, this grouping has 7 kings, but then this seems to be somehow different from the heads, and the 10 horns are 10 kings. And if you're still getting confused, don't worry. Once I start breaking down the different interpretations, they're going to start explaining how these things plug in, okay? So they'll help fill the gap a little bit for you. So we see this beast is one that was, is not, and yet is. We see the 7 heads are 7 mountains and 7 kings. And then the 10 horns are 10 kings who are going to reign with the beast. So notice how the 10 horns are connected to the beast, but they also are distinct from the beast, right? They rule with the beast. So you have to remember, once again, symbolic. So there's way they can give and take with how they're explaining things. Okay, so we see that described for the beast. And then we see that the woman in verse 18 is called the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. So it seems to be that it's describing it as a great city that seems to be over, right, the different kings or these different kingdoms, right, that are present on the earth. And then it even goes on to say in verse 15 that also how not only was it on the beast, but it was also on the waters. It says that in verse 15 that the waters represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So what that basically means is that this woman, Babylon, this great city, it's affecting and controlling the entire world. All different types of people, different cultures, all of that is being affected by this woman, which is Babylon. And then in verse 16, we see something kind of interesting. It says, and the 10 kings, which are the 10 horns, it says that they actually at some point hate the scarlet woman. This is why we have to remember these two are separate. They're not identical, right? So the 10 horns, it says that they, in verse 16, hate the harlot, and then it goes on and says that basically they kill her. It says, and the 10 horns, which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. So we at first see this woman is riding the beast, and that they both seem to be doing well, destroying and warring and killing the saints and the martyrs of Jesus Christ. But at some point, with these different kings, eventually the group of 10 kings hate the woman at some point and get rid of her. So that is basically all that we get in chapter 17. We'll get more of the fall of Babylon in chapter 18, which we'll have to wait for. But now that we kind of have at least seen who are the characters, what are some of the interpretations that the angel gives us, now how are we to understand it, right? That's what we're going to go into now. So I'm going to share with you 3 different interpretations. They're up there on the PowerPoint if you'd like to look. So we have the idealist perspective, the preterist, and the futurist. Some of you guys have already been introduced to these, so this will just be a recap for you. But if it's new or if you need a refresher, so the idealist basically says, when you look at the book of Revelation, when you're reading it, you're seeing that these are all prophecies that are being fulfilled recurrently throughout history. So you're not looking for just a future consummation. You're not looking for just one past event. This is meant to describe all of history and how the Bible is showing that it continues to occur. These different things are symbolic and they will continue to be reoccurring throughout history. Then you have the preterist, and that basically is going to say that when you look at Revelation, basically all of these prophecies have already been fulfilled in the ancient past. And most of them are going to say right around AD 70, where the temple was destroyed, where Jerusalem was attacked by Rome. And then the futurist is going to say, when we look at Revelation, most of these prophecies are still future. They still haven't happened, and we're looking for a time in the future where they will all happen. So those are the different approaches as we look at chapter 17 now. How do they understand what's going on here? So the idealist, so the prophecies fulfilled recurrently throughout history, what they would say is this, that the woman is a representative of the anti-God systems of mankind in every age of life. So when you think about all these different anti-Christian, anti-God systems, whether they're government, right, cultural systems, media, all of these different things, they are the woman. They are the woman that impacts and affects the world. And how they would say that Babylon and Rome are historical prime examples. Basically, if you want to see what's a good example of what this woman is like, it's like when Babylon affected the world. It's like when Rome affected the culture in the world. So they'd say that that is an anti-God system that corrupts the world. And then the idealists would say that the beast is the persecuting power of Satan that we see operating through the nations of this world and their governments. So you have the coercion, the corruption, false doctrine, right? All of these different things that you see the woman try to entice you with. And then on the other side, you have the beast that will start to persecute and will have the government or the military force to basically coerce you to go with the woman. So you see that they're different, but they have some type of connection to one another. And it's always inspired by satanic rule. So Satan is leading these governments or leading these nations to persecute individuals. So when we look then at the beast of the idealist and we look at the 7 heads, what they would say is that the 7 heads are have a twofold meaning. They would say in one sense, it is the present embodiment of Rome. So Rome, during John's time, when he was writing this, Rome was the primary force. So when John's writing this, he has a symbolic meaning, but he also has a, hey, right now I'm talking about Rome. So what they would say is there's this, there's the present embodiment. Right now, Rome is the beast, right? That's what the heads mean. But then they would also say, but it's also the embodiment throughout history. So not only are you seeing this now, but it's in yet to come, right? How we talked about it was in the past, it's now, and it's also later. They're saying this is supposed to be Rome as an example of what continues to happen throughout history. And then when they look at the 10 horns, they would say that this could be a symbolic number of all anti-Christian powers on the earth that make war on the Lamb. So when we think about all the different government powers, these are kings, leaders that all are warring against Christ or warring against his church or the saints. So that is how the idealist would look at this group of symbols. The preterist would say that the woman is either the city of Rome or the city of Jerusalem. If you remember, I described how the preterists kind of start to shift around this point, and some think that we continue to talk about Jerusalem being destroyed, and some others think that Babylon switches the topic and focuses solely on Rome. So there's a little bit of a debate, but either the woman is representing Rome or Jerusalem. And then when they look at the beast, they would say that the beast is clearly Rome because Rome was known as the city on 7 hills. So if we see that it says that the 7 heads represent 7 mountains or 7 hills, they're saying that John is clearly letting the readers know, I'm talking about Rome in code. So Rome doesn't know who I'm addressing here. So he's saying that this is clearly saying the beast is Rome and or Nero, who would have been the emperor right around the time of John for the preterist interpretation. So then when we look at the 7 kings that are described for the 7 heads, and if it's associated with Rome, the preterist then says that what this is describing is the dynasty of the Caesars. So, Caesars, right? Julius Caesar. We think about these different Caesars. And so what they would say is you have these groups of Caesars that have reigned over time. And what we're describing then is how 5 have fallen. What they're saying is 5 of the Caesars have now died. 1 is, and then 1 is yet to come and is going to basically do what is being described as this final beast. And so there are different ways of them kind of ranking and numbering. So I'll just read for you who these Caesars are and just kind of share a little bit of what some of the things they have to wrestle with. So number 1, you have Augustus. Number 2, Tiberius. Number 3, Caligula. Number 4, Claudius. Number 5, Nero. Number 6, Galba. Number 7, Otho. Number 8, Vitellius. Number 9, Vespasian. Number 10, Titus. And number 11, Domitian. So here is why there's a little bit of difficulty. So if we say that 5 have fallen, that would mean that it goes up to Nero being fallen at this point. So Nero, he did commit suicide at AD 68. That's about 2 years before AD 70 happens, right? So we see that there's 5 that would have fallen at that point. And then it says the 6th is now, and which would be Galba. And then the 7th would technically be Otho. But most preterists will say that it's not meant to be Otho that is the one, because he doesn't seem to actually have much of an impact on anything politically or religiously, and he actually doesn't reign very long. Actually, I think the next 3, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, all don't really seem to have any historical impact. So then what they end up doing is they end up skipping those 3, not counting them, and then go into either describing it somehow connecting with Vespasian, Titus, or Domitian, which Domitian, which is the 11th, has been called the second Nero before, where some would say that there was this rumor going on that Nero, though he died, he was going to come back from the east. There was this rumor in that time period, and maybe Domitian was supposed to be that. So that's one thing the preterists would have to figure out, is how these numbering of these Caesars work. But that's usually how they address it. It's 7 kings, which represent one of the groupings of 7 Caesars. Then the 10 horns represent 10 kings or countries subjected by Rome, or 10 provincial governors that supported Rome. So basically just another group of 10 leaders in some capacity that were contemporaries of the Roman Caesars at that time. So that's who the 10 horns are. So there are 10 kings that basically worked with Rome in some capacity. So that's how the preterists would take that. And actually there was, I believe it was Vespasian that actually had 10 groups of leaders that helped him in his reign of Rome at the time. So then finally, when we look at the futurist interpretation, we see that there are actually a couple of ways that they can take the woman. The woman is either a symbol for Rome, which would be similar to what we saw with the preterists and even some idealists. Or they might say that it's another city that it's going to rule the entire world that's yet future, that might be like Rome or like Babylon, or maybe even a revived Roman Empire potentially. Or there might be a symbolic representation here describing a religious entity like a coalition of apostate churches located in Rome. And if you haven't already, your ear didn't perk up a little bit when I said that, there are many that actually think this might relate to the Vatican, which is interesting because the Vatican is located in Rome. It's a very powerful religious entity here, and it seems described that there's something in Rome that has some type of religious and manipulation effect that's going on for people at this time, whether it's, that's obviously if it's future, because this is a futurist perspective. But some believe because it talks about this fornication and this adultery and being a harlot, that was usually language that was used for Jerusalem when they would go after idols or whenever they would commit spiritual adultery. So if this is describing a religious group that's supposed to be or was being faithful at one point and then has changed or has defected, basically, then this could very well be a religious group that has great power in the area of Rome that then is starting to affect the world. And then one last potential for the woman for a futurist perspective would say that maybe this is an interpretation that's saying that Babylon is principally just being described as a political, cultural, and or commercial force. So kind of similar to the idealist, how it could just have this overwhelming impact on the universal world. How just however it is, maybe it's not an actual power, maybe it's not a religious organization, maybe it's just the force and the temptation of this spiritual Babylon that exists in the world. So when it comes to the beast for the futurist, they would say that this is most likely is the man of sin, which is mentioned in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which seems to be present during the end of the age, where right before Christ returns, because it says that when Christ returns, the man of lawlessness or the man of sin is killed at the sight or the appearance of his coming. So they would say that this is the final dictator of the world, who's also described in Daniel 7 as the little horn. So you remember in Daniel 7, we've read it a couple weeks ago, there's this little horn that rises up with the 10 horns, and this little horn ends up basically knocking down 3 of the 10 horns. It basically becomes the most prominent, which if we remember, we're seeing 10 horns here, and there seems to be this connection to Daniel 7 with the book of Revelation, well, actually a lot of Daniel with the book of Revelation. So they think then that he is the beast described here, the little horn, the man of lawlessness, the man of sin. And what he does then is he uses the systems of religion and culture, meaning he uses the woman for a period of time. And then whenever he gets to a certain amount of power, what he then does is he overthrows the woman. He overthrows the religion, he overthrows the government, he overthrows the nation, and then he sets up basically his own empire where he starts to receive all of the world's worship, right? And he starts to say all of these blasphemous things that would be saying he's claiming to be divine. So he's actually saying, worship me, I'm the true king. So that's how they would understand this. And so when we then look at the beast and look at the 7 heads for the futurist, what they're going to say is this could allude to Rome in some sense, like many of the others, but it might also describe the succession of empires that existed at the time. So if we once again look at the 5 already fallen, what a futurist is going to say is that this is talking about Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. All civilizations that had been conquered or had fallen at this point, with Rome being the one that was current in the time of John, so the one that is, and then the one that is to come. There is this 7th empire that is future yet for us. And then it says, and there's this weird phrase that says, and the 8th is of the 7th, or the 8th is of the 7, which seems to indicate that this 8th leader, or this 8th empire, somehow connects and has an origin or root in the 7th empire. So if there's this future kingdom or future empire to come, there's this 8th one, which I think is the little horn. He rises up out of the 7th and makes his 8th kingdom, which is the final kingdom before Christ comes. So that would be the kingdom of the Antichrist. So that's how they would look at the 7 kings. They would say these are 7 kingdoms. Like Daniel, he talks about it being kings, but then he says that they're actually kingdoms. And so they're saying this is the 7 kingdoms that we're talking about throughout history, starting with Egypt. And then we look at the 10 horns. And as we said, the 10 horns are 10 kings. And the way that they differ from the 7 kings is, if you remember, the 7 kings are part of the heads, but the horns are on a head. So how they differ is that the 7 kings are moving in succession over time, but the 10 kings are simultaneous. So these are 10 kings at the very end of history that they rise to power, and they support the final king of, or the little horn, the Antichrist, the beast, the true beast. The 10 horns, basically, they help and support the Antichrist. So what they're saying is this is a future group of 10 kings who are going to help the beast come to power and support him, and eventually overthrow the woman, the city, and her system altogether. And if you remember, we read about earlier the kings of the East coming over, and we've talked about the coalition of European kingdoms. It's very possible that these kings might be those kings from the East that come to work and support the beast as they overthrow the woman. So those are 3 interpretations of this chapter. We're almost right at time. I'll be happy to stick around and answer some questions or comments. I'm going to just share with you a few application points before we close. And like as I said, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them after that. So what are some things we can apply with all of this symbolism? The first thing is this, that saints should expect persecution and martyrdom. That doesn't mean that we should go and look for it. We shouldn't be excited to go and get persecuted, right? We shouldn't be trying to say, I'm persecuted if someone just said something not nice on Facebook, right? But we should expect it. We should be faithful to Christ and know that no matter what time in history, there will be the kingdoms of darkness that don't like kingdoms of light. So we need to be not shocked if we experience persecution, and we should be praying for those who are brothers and sisters that are, because though in America we might not be seeing it as often, we clearly see it in other countries where there are saints being persecuted by entities that are very similar, if not the beast and the woman. So saints should expect persecution and martyrdom. In verse 14, we are reminded that the Lamb will overcome all enemies. Verse 14, it says, these will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. And this is a reminder that we see all the time throughout the book. Things look really, really bad. These beasts, these women, all these things going on look so devastating. But then it always says, but Jesus is king. The Lamb is going to overcome. His kingdom is coming. His will be done. He's victorious. Those who are in him will be victorious. And that's what it's saying. And if you were in Christ, then you are called, chosen, and faithful. So we can rejoice even through persecution, even through martyrdom, no matter what we experience, no matter what kingdom is rising, we know Christ's kingdom will overcome them. And then finally, in verse 17, we see that God is working all things for good, for his purposes. Verse 17, it says, for God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So though these kings, though they're evil, they're wicked, though they think they're resisting God and they think that they know what they're going to do and they're trying to get power, God is literally doing this on purpose. He's letting them get to a certain point. He's letting certain things happen, unfold in history so that his words are fulfilled. God has a plan. God is sovereign. God's in control, and he knows that we're all going to win. And that's something we can always apply and we can be thankful for. So, saints, we can expect and endure through persecution because Christ will overcome, and he's working all things for good.